Chapter 4. There's been an accident, GD said. Constance had turned into Hillside Road on her way to Mrs. Clark's house. Outside one of the houses there was a crowd of people. And an ambulance, lights still flashing. It's Mrs. Clark's house, Constance said. She drew up at the side of the road and parked her car in the shade of a tree. All along the street there were flame trees in full bloom, providing color, shade and beauty. Mrs. Clark's own garden was large enough to have trees growing in it. There were also many flowers, especially roses and dahlias, and small shrubs and bushes. It was clear that great care had been taken over many years to make the garden a place of joy and beauty. As Constance and GD approached the front gate, two men came out of the house. They were carrying a stretcher. "Oh, no," Constance said, suddenly fearful. "It's Mrs. Clark. It must be Mrs. Clark." The blankets covering the body were of the kind often used in hospitals. They were a deep red color, similar to the blossom on the flame trees. The two men carrying the stretcher had no difficulty. Mrs. Clark was very thin and frail. Following on behind the stretcher, almost skipping in her efforts not to be left behind, was Bokiti. Tears flowed down her cheeks. Constance managed to look at Mrs. Clark as the two orderlies placed the stretcher in the back of the ambulance. "Is she?" GD said, unable to complete his question. "She's alive," Constance told him, "but she doesn't seem to be conscious." The ambulance sped away quickly down the street, lights flashing and klaxon horn sounding urgently, warning other drivers to keep the way clear. "Nobody went with her," Constance said. "She told me to stay here," Bokiti replied. Constance and GD helped Bokiti back to the house. Neighbors and passers-by went about their business once again. I'll wait outside," GD said. He knew that it would be better for Constance to be alone with Bokiti. The two women boiled water to make tea. Bokiti's tears dried, but she still sighed heavily and unhappily from time to time. "I know that she will die," Bokiti said, "but the pain is too much. For many years, Mrs. Clark was my good friend." "What happened?" Constance asked. "It is dizziness," Bokiti replied. "She became very dizzy. She said that the house was spinning round. I telephoned the doctor and he, no, not like that." "I beg your pardon," Constance said, surprised by Bokiti's change of tone. Constance had taken tea leaves from a tin and was about to put them in the teapot. "You must always put boiling water in the pot first," Bokiti said. "Then the tea leaves." "Does it really matter?" Constance asked, smiling a little. She knew that some people were fussy about such things. Her own mother was an example. There was a right and a wrong way to do everything, her mother had often told her. There was a right and a wrong way to brew tea. A few minutes later both Constance and Bokiti were sitting in the large room of the house. On the walls there were paintings and photographs. Some of the photographs were old. Several were of a pretty young white woman, Mrs. Clark herself when young. "How people change," Constance said, almost to herself. "Mrs. Clark, she was very active," Bokiti replied. "Until she became sick." "When was that?" Constance asked. "Only 2 years ago," Bokiti said. "But in the last few weeks the sickness has become much worse." "That must be why she decided to make her last will and testament," Constance said. "That's why she got in touch with our company." "Why do old people always become like this?" Bokiti said. "Sadly, not everyone becomes sick," Constance answered. "Some old people remain very strong and active." "In any case, Bokiti, Mrs. Clark isn't very old." Constance picked up her briefcase. She took out a file, the one holding the papers she had completed with Mrs. Clark on her first visit to this house. She checked Mrs. Clark's date of birth. She isn't even 60 years old. It's only because of her illness that she appears to be old. The reason Constance had come to the house was to get Mrs. Clark to sign these papers, her last wishes concerning her money and property. Now there was danger that Mrs. Clark would die before she had placed her signature on the document. She had told Constance her wishes, and Constance had written everything down. The papers had been typed by Alice McCond. So far everything was legal. But if relatives opposed the will, and if they took the matter to court, there would be a problem because of the lack of a signature. May I use the telephone? Constance asked. Yebwa, Bokiti replied. I'll ring the hospital, Constance added. Or would you like to talk, Bokiti? No, Bokiti replied, holding up her hands. I do not like to speak into that machine. Constance smiled. Her own mother had been the same. In many ways Bokiti and her mother were alike. Except that her mother had stayed in the village all her life and had never taken paid employment, and certainly would not have been happy doing housework for another woman. Getting through to the hospital was not a problem, but having the call transferred from the central switchboard to the ward where Mrs. Clark was a patient took a little while longer. When someone finally picked up the telephone, the first thing he did was to apologize for the delay. It was a man. I'd like to speak to the ward sister, please, Constance said. In connection with what? The man asked Mrs. Clark. She was admitted a short time ago. Emily Louise Clark. You're not a relative, are you? My name is Constance Majolo. I'm Mrs. Clark's attorney. The man lost no time in bringing the ward sister to the telephone. The woman told Constance that Mrs. Clark had been unconscious on arrival but had now regained consciousness. May I visit her? Constance asked. I need her signature on a document. She should not be disturbed, the nurse replied. It's important, Constance said, and Mrs. Clark would certainly wish to sign the document. Call again in 2 hours, the nurse suggested. Ask to speak to me. Is she going to live? Constance asked. She's a tough woman, the nurse said. Ask me again in 2 hours, Constance said, interrupting. As she put down the telephone receiver, Constance decided that she really must learn to stop interrupting other people, even when they were trying to deny her important information. When Constance went back to the sitting room, Bokiti was no longer there. She went to the kitchen and Bokiti was not there either. Then she saw, through a window, that Bokiti had taken tea to GD. Both were sitting on the veranda, away from the glare and heat of the sun. Constance went to join them. The veranda went round the whole of the houses. There was fine netting to keep mosquitoes from entering the house at night. On one side there was a bed. Perhaps Mrs. Clark, or Bokiti, slept on the veranda when the nights were especially hot, as in the months of October or November. The garden was in excellent condition. These were not new houses, so there had been many years for plants and trees to be planted and to mature. This is a very beautiful garden, Constance said. Jacob takes great care with the plants, Bokiti replied. Where is he now? Constance asked. She had forgotten about the other person in this house. At that very moment, Jacob rode into the drive and up to the back door. He was sweating from his efforts. The bicycle that he rode was an old one, with no gears. That made it harder to ride. It also meant that there were fewer things to go wrong. The bicycle suited Jacob. Like him, it was strong and old and reliable. Bokiti greeted Jacob and quickly told him what had happened. He went to his room, which was the servant's house at the bottom of the garden at the back of the house. GD accompanied him. A few minutes later, GD returned. He told Bokiti and Constance that Jacob was having a shower. I'll make more tea, Bokiti said. Constance checked her watch. She knew that she had to telephone the hospital again later. She could do that from the office just as well as from here, but there was no need to return to the office that day, or even the next. She had been given leave of absence. Finding Daniel Clark was a matter of importance, especially now that there was the danger Mrs. Clark might not live much longer. I'll help you, Constance said, joining Bokiti in the kitchen. Bokiti made the tea, taking care to pour boiling water in the pot before putting in the tea leaves, and took a tin from a cupboard. In the tin there was an assortment of biscuits. Constance loved biscuits, although she rarely bought any herself. The main reason was their cost. A junior member of a law firm's salary is not very high. Constance took tea and biscuits out to GD. He smiled happily. Being with Constance gave him pleasure. It was much better than being ordered about by people in the office, or having every movement carefully noted by Mrs. Maribi as she sat in her glass-walled office. He had already decided that when Constance had her own law business he would seek employment with her. Lai was sure that she would find him work, and possibly, even, something better than being just a messenger. Not long afterwards, Jacob came back to the house. He had taken his shower and changed into a dark suit. He was even wearing a dark tie. It was almost as if, Constance thought, he was already preparing for Mrs. Clark's funeral. "I am going to the hospital," Jacob announced. Bokiti nodded her head but did not reply. "How will you get there?" Constance asked him. "I have my bicycle," Jacob replied. "Let me give you a lift in my motor car," Constance said. "I would not wish to put you to the trouble," Jacob told her. "No trouble at all," Constance assured him. "In any case, I also want to see Mrs. Clark." "Why?" Jacob asked, suddenly. "Why do you want to see her?" "To get her signature on a document," Constance answered. "Her last will and testament." Jacob seemed reassured. He nodded his agreement. "Let us go now," he said. "While there is time." By the time they left the house it was late afternoon. It was the rush hour in the city. Everyone was anxious to get home after the day's work. There were many people on foot, the taxis and combis were crowded, and the streets full of motor cars. Some drivers hooted their horns impatiently. Others played music very loud. People in the hospital were sick or dying, but in the city life went on as usual. Constance had time to talk to Jacob and ask him questions. "Have you been employed by Mrs. Clark for many years, Jacob?" she asked. "Yes, many years," he replied briefly. "She is very seriously ill." "You know that, don't you?" "Yes, I know that," he replied. It was clear that he did not wish to talk. So Constance kept quiet. So did GD, who was sitting in the back seat with Jacob. On arrival at the hospital, GD said that he would wait in the car. Constance could accompany Jacob. She thought this was a very good idea. First they went to a reception desk and then were allowed to go to the ward where Mrs. Clark was a patient. There was the sickly sweet smell of something that Constance always associated with hospitals, but she was uncertain whether it was disinfectant or air freshener, or a mixture of both. The ward was not as large as Constance had expected it to be. All patients had their own private room. A young nurse showed Jacob and Constance into Mrs. Clark's room. Constance was carrying her briefcase. If she had a chance to get Mrs. Clark's signature, she would take the opportunity. Mrs. Clark was stretched out on the bed. There were tubes fixed to her arms. Her face was like thin pale paper. Her eyes were closed and she hardly seemed to be breathing at all. Jacob sat down on a chair placed at the bedside. He took hold of Mrs. Clark's hand. On his face there was a look of great sadness and tenderness. "Is that you, Jacob?" Constance was startled. Mrs. Clark was neither unconscious nor asleep. Her voice was thin, weak, but still clear enough to be heard. "Yes," Jacob replied. At that moment, the ward sister appeared at the door. She called Constance from the room. "Are you the one who telephoned?" she asked. "Yes. I'm Mrs. Clark's attorney, Constance Majolo. It's very important that I get Mrs. Clark to sign her last will and testament." "She's very weak," the ward sister replied, "but she's conscious," Constance told her. "She just spoke to Jacob." "Jacob? He works for Mrs. Clark. He's her gardener." "Are there no relatives?" the ward sister asked. We need to know the name of Mrs. Clark's next of kin. In case I understand, Constance said. Is she going to die? Very soon, the ward sister answered. You can see for yourself. Her illness is something that is sapping her strength fast. How long has she got? Constance asked. It's difficult to tell. Days. Possibly even weeks. It depends so much on the person's willpower. There is a son, Constance said. Daniel. Oh, good. Do you have his address? Unfortunately, no, I don't, Constance said. That's the main problem. I don't know. His own mother doesn't even know whether Daniel is still living in this city. Perhaps the police could help, the ward sister said. Possibly, Constance replied. The other problem is that his own mother hasn't seen him for 20 years. We don't even know if Daniel Clark is still in this city, or even if he's still alive. But one thing is certain. What's that? With Mrs. Clark so ill, so close to death, it is now vitally important to find Daniel, and to find him without any delay.